Good afternoon. My name is Terry Surrey. I am the director for Gallery 210 at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And on behalf of the gallery, our board, and the artists, welcome to today's virtual panel discussion on the exhibition Exposure 21, Three Myths. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge those persons, organizations, and agencies that make this exhibition possible. First, my sincerest thanks to artists Julia Curran, Lola Ogbara, and Emma Vidal for their early and enthusiastic support of this project. I deeply appreciate their making new artwork for the exhibition and their flexibility, patience, and good humor in working with the gallery in the middle of the pandemic. It's been a pleasure to work with you all. I also want to thank Jessica Baran for graciously accepting our invitation to moderate today's panel discussion. I want to thank Angela Slick, Anna Myers, Eric Eggers, and Reagan Slaughter for their volunteer work on this exhibition. I want to acknowledge the support of Dr. Andrew Kirsten, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and the College 210 Advisory Committee, Dr. Maureen Quigley, Chair of the Department of Art and Design, and my colleagues in the Department of Art and Design. This exhibition is supported in part by the College of Arts and Sciences and Missouri Arts Council, a state agency. Now, a few words about our panelist and moderator. Julia Curran received a Bachelor of Arts from Truman State University and a Master of Fine Arts from Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi. Julia was a Fulbright Scholar in Paris, France, where she apprenticed with artists throughout the country and led international collaborative curatorial projects. Julia is currently based in her hometown, St. Louis, Missouri. She writes, "I am a classically trained visual artist and printmaker, and my work explores myth, gender politics, and the excesses of American capitalism. Currently, I'm exploring these types of topics in a relationship to the body and health, as well as to different feminine archetypes, something I see as an entity to the many current, overwhelming global and intrapersonal struggles." Lola Ogbara was born and raised in Chicago. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Arts and Entertainment and Media Management from Columbia College, Chicago. She received her MFA from Washington University this year. Lola has received numerous honors and awards, including the Multicultural Fellowship sponsored by the NCECA 52nd Annual Conference, and has shown work in galleries and museums across the country, including St. Louis. She writes of her work, "My practice explores the multifaceted implications and ramifications of sexuality in regards to the Black experience. I work with clay as a material in order to emphasize a necessary fragility, which symbolizes an essential contradiction implicit in empowerments." Emma Vidal was born in Marseille, France, and trained at the Central St. Martin's College of Arts and Design in London. Emma works and lives between France and the United States. She is currently a resident at Intersect Arts Center in St. Louis, Missouri. Emma has exhibited in prestigious institutions, including Volta Basel, Victoria and Albert Museum, London, Wellcome Collection Museum, London, Museum Blue in St. Louis, and Royal West of England Academy in Bristol. Her ceramic and mixed media sculptures, as well as her monochromatic large charcoal pieces, are included in collections worldwide. Of her work, she writes, "Nourished by in-depth research on the beginning of collective human story, the future of humankind, and largely influenced by myths, history, and literature, I dedicated the last 6 years of the invention of an imaginary future place whose inhabitants consist only of feral children, and where Mother Nature is claiming back her own territory. I continue to chart new corners of this world through golden ceramic divinities, large-scale detailed black and white charcoal drawings, and mixed media sculptures." And tonight's moderator, Jessica Baran, is a poet, curator, critic, and director of the curatorial program development at Barrett Barra Projects in St. Louis. She is the author of 3 poetry collections and the former art writer for the Riverfront Times. She was the assistant director of the St. Louis-based gallery's White Flag and director of Fort Godell Compound for the Arts. She is also an educator who has instructed and advised graduate students in the MFA program at the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Art. Originally from Northwest Indiana, she holds a BA in Visual Art from Columbia University, New York, and an MFA in Poetry from Washington University in St. Louis. I want to thank you all for participating in tonight's program. Turn this program over now to Jessica.
I'm really thrilled to be talking today with Julia Curran, Lola Ogbara, and Emma Vidal. This is a really, I think it is a special feat given that this show was put together amidst these past few months and the challenges they've imposed. So congratulations to all three of you for putting together such a beautiful show. And fortunately, Terry will be providing some images since the show probably hasn't been viewed by most of you. Also, we will open up the discussion in the last 10 to 15 minutes to a Q&A. If you're not necessarily familiar with Zoom, you see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A function is down at the bottom sidebar, and you can enter questions and we will hopefully get to all of them. But I definitely encourage you as we're talking to just put those in. They won't be, like I said, responded to immediately, but at the very end of the discussion. Also, if you keep your eyes on the chat, Terry will be adding links to each of the artists' websites as well as the exhibition website, so you can have all of the hours and visiting info and what will eventually be, I know, documentation that includes both video and photographs of the show, so you can also view it remotely. So without further explication, I'd like to start with having each of you discuss the work that you have produced for this show, and specifically how it both pushes against and then works within this overriding theme of myth, which is a really brilliant concept that does in fact stitch together what are three, in fact, sort of disparate practices, but also ones that as you've come to realize through speaking with one another and also through putting the show together, have a lot of commonalities. So I will start with Julia, whose image is currently on the screen. Julia, can you tell us about this work and, again, how you see myth either fitting or not fitting within what you do?
Sure. Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you for everyone for being here today with us. So, myth, when I'm thinking of myth in this body of work, I'm thinking of stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and how we're supposed to behave. So for example, gender is a myth, you know, the way that men are supposed to behave and the way that women are supposed to behave. That's an example of these social and cultural myths that we have. And in this body of work, I'm particularly interested in how we exist as organisms and how we exist and how all that we construct about human mythology and you know, trying to understand our human nature can sometimes be a myth, you know, and in reality we're these you know, we're these sensory organisms. For example, even just talking right now, you know, feeling a little nervous as things are just getting started off, and I can feel my heart beating in my chest. So this work is really an exploration of that, you know, and just these visceral experiences that we have.
Excellent, thank you. And we're going to unpack this more. So this is just our first stab. So I will then go to Lola, and maybe I'll have Terry, you can pull up the slide of Lola's work.
All right, so as far as myth in relation to the work that I am doing, I'm interested in the misconceptions and the internalizations and the implications, the things that we're told about ourselves, that we believe, and so we act accordingly. These implications of Black femme existence, and particularly sexuality. And so my aim is to demystify or unmask these perpetuated misconceptions about the body or the sexuality and or gender. So some of the work you would see is it's very clever or even humorous, and attempts to kind of poke fun at these structures, and also the accessibility and viewership and the power imbalance that we experience in viewership in art.
Thank you. And Emma? And Terry, if you could put the slide of Emma's work. Excellent.
Perfect. So in my work, I'm very interested in how myth are created within civilization. So all of my work, like it can be from the charcoal drawing that you can see on the picture or the sculptures. It's always about this creation of this myth with where time is suspended. And I try to imagine like a future place where this tribe of children called the Lost Boys are kind of going through their own quest of going through the detritus of a forgotten civilization to create their own, and to create their own form of belief and their own wonder, let's say. So I would say that myth is very central to my work in this way, that it's all about the storytelling and how to create a new world, and each drawing is going to be kind of a window into this world and giving more clue about this myth, and the sculptures are more like divinities brought back to the exhibition space.
Thank you. So I'm thinking about how, now that fortunately too the viewers have been able to see a glimpse of the installation, how each of you are rooted in very process-based materials. So Emma and Julia working actually Emma, you haven't worked in printmaking, have you, per se? But I suppose it's more coming out of a drawing and painting tradition, correct?
Correct, yeah. And painting relatively new as well.
Okay. All of which is process-based. and then also Lola and Julia working with ceramics, and Lola and Emma working with ceramics. I'm just conflating everyone right now. Pardon me, sorry. I'm being distracted by Zoom here. I saw Lola flicker out, and it just goes to show, okay, about to grab my charger. Okay, awesome. It just goes to show how delicate my mind is, that it is apparently. So let me just backtrack here again. Thinking actually again about process-driven materials. So ceramics and printmaking specifically were on my mind. So somehow that got scrambled in the process, literally. But also, though, your practices could be, I think, accurately described as conceptual. So something I was wondering about each of your practices is whether or not the concepts comes first and then you have been led to these materials, or if it's just the opposite, that the concept is secondary to the fact that you've been just simply either exploring in clay, for instance, or making prints, and then suddenly the concept emerges. But we'll start with Julia, just to keep them in the same order.
Sure. So my background's in printmaking, and I tell a story, whenever I'm doing artist talks about how I got into printmaking, because in the first day of undergrad, I walked into the print studio, not really sure what I was going to major in. And in the print studio, there were people standing on a table, singing and dancing to a song. And there was a disco ball hanging from the ceiling, and a bunch of people just all in the studio working together. And I was like, wow, like this is really where I belong. And so printmaking is just this, it's really wonderful because it's very community-based, and it's this area where everyone has to revolve around the material, right? Because it has to do with these really expensive presses and equipment. And so traditionally everybody is sharing a shop together. And with that, printmaking is known as the most democratic medium because just of its history of disseminating information. Because with printmaking, you're making more than one copy of an image. And so, for example, that's how books were first printed, by hand, and religious texts and narrative images, and, protest posters and resistance pamphlets and information. So it's known as the most democratic medium. So that's my background. I've been working in printmaking for 10 years. And the work in this show, most of it is mixed media paintings, specifically mixed media altarpieces. So it's unfortunate because you can't see in the images right now. You will be able to when it's all virtual. But the altarpieces that I made have paintings on the inside and the outside. They're like these 3 hinged triptych panels that open and close. And I've also been making shadow boxes as well. And I got really interested in those, just thinking about, these are kind of like little altarpieces to human nature and altarpieces to our bodies and our experiences and our inner worlds. And so I've been really interested in not only European Renaissance triptych altarpieces, like very grandiose ones you would find in a church, but also I'm an avid collector of Mexican folk art, and I have a really lovely little collection of different shadow boxes around our house with different little dioramas of things happening. And so that's what got me into that medium.
Nice. So it feels like, again, I really don't necessarily think it's ever one or the other, but it's sort of like the printmaking got you there, but then it's also come back as a medium that's also driven the process at times, even though you've kind of strayed from it occasionally. And that makes a lot of sense with this new work too, which, as you said, isn't necessarily about multiples. They're actually all mostly predominantly unique pieces.
And you can see with the work in the show that I tried to exhibit both the unique pieces, which are combinations of painting, collage, and prints, and then the actual prints where some of the imagery originally came from. So you'll notice some repeating motifs, and oftentimes in the paintings, those are actually prints that I just cut up and reassembled into paintings.
Excellent, thanks. And Lola, how do you think about this relationship between process and concept?
Well, for me, I am not married to one medium, whether that be clay or photo. And so being that, my practice is very conceptual, is very theory-based. I'm always doing a lot of research and a lot of writing. And so I'm always thinking of the conceptual. The process behind clay in particular aids the conceptual in terms of complexity. And so they often overlap to create a deeper conversation. With photo, the process of photo can be very mundane. So in this work, particularly the piece entitled, well, it's untitled, but it was done in 2018. It's an inkjet print, but it was torn. So I ripped it up and then I reconstructed it. And so that process alone kind of speaks to my interest in reconstructing the idea of humanness in terms of Black femininity and Black gender, and Black in the body all overall. So I'm always thinking conceptually, leading with that first, and process follows, usually creating this moment with happy accidents, which is also interesting.
Yeah, it is. So it's interesting to me that the concept led you to ceramics. Ceramics wasn't something you had always done, and then it simply then expanded into other media, or you had the concept and then it led you to actually begin experimenting in clay?
Yeah, the concept has always been there. My background was in 2D, so I was doing more illustration work for a very deep and complex conversation, and it wasn't fitting. So I had to go into something that fit the conversation, that propelled the conversation. And for me, it was clay, because of my accessibility to clay, but also because of this fragility in clay, which can be manipulated. could be very fragile in one instance, and it can be very, very hard and rough medium. And so there's many faucets, many, face values of clay that kind of speak to my subject matter. So it ended up, being probably the perfect medium for this.
Yeah.
For this work.
That's, again, it's really interesting to me, because I also think that at least in the 20th century, there's been an aesthetic correlation between new media like photography or video to conceptualism, but not as much to something like ceramics, which I think has been, along with printmaking, and in fact, along with most physically based media, even drawing and printmaking, is they've been aligned with a kind of handicraft, and this idea of that tension between something not being conceptual because it's handicraft, and then, but actually resurrecting those very qualities as, in fact, conceptual information, is, I think, actually seems very charged in your work.
Absolutely. It's for me, it's the fact that clay can bring so much heartbreak. I know Emma has witnessed one of my meltdowns using kiln and, having worked so hard and for things to explode, but then it can also be very rewarding. And I think that speaks to like the heart of Black identity, kind of going through the process and the navigation of that identity and having these wonderful moments, but then also experiencing so much heartbreak. So definitely.
That's great, and that's a good bridge to Emma. Actually, are you both at Intersect, or how would you have shared a kiln, maybe, or witnessed each other's process?
I was trying.
COVID. Me needing to find a place to fire, and her being able to help.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. And so, Emma, so thinking about your relationship to ceramics being so new, and but like I said, despite my completely garbled question initially, you have been always working in these very process-heavy media in terms of observed drawings, like very heavily rendered and then very carefully painted paintings, as indicated. The full range is on view here in this show. So I'm interested in hearing how maybe these process-heavy materials contribute to the way in which you're thinking about narrative too in your work.
Yes. So I don't know how to start to answer this question. I think
anywhere. I throw a wide net out so you can.
So I'm gonna start by my relationship to clay. So it's very new to me. So I started working with clay only 2 years ago, when I moved to St. Louis and started to have my studio at Intersect, where we had like amazing facilities. And so discovering clay was like a huge eye-opener for me, because I used to work mostly with mixed media sculpture, mostly like the accumulation of a lot of little elements. So one of my first sculptures was made with push pins, these golden pins, and like there were like 200,000 of them. And it's really like this massive accumulation, creating again this type of little deity that could be adorned by this imaginary tribe of the Lost Boys. But quickly I found myself very like constrained by the actual material I would use. So by the color, by even the material themselves, their size and shape. And I think clay has been always something I've been fascinated about. I really love the fact that it has this, as you were saying, this kind of, it's a bit like very traditional medium. It's a bit obsolete, and now it's coming back, and it has this like very shiny aspect to it. And it's like, I love to use luster, which is like this, luster is like the final gold that you put on it, and it has this brightness that is incredible. So it's, I lost myself, but I was really fascinated by clay and ceramics, and I think it's really allowed me to do what I wanted to do with my sculptures, because it has so much freedom. There is no limits to what I can create with it, and this I particularly appreciate it. After, like Lola was saying, it's clay is a really like capricious medium. So it's most of my sculptures, like I could spend like 2 months on them, and you never know what you're gonna find, even more when there's like multiple firing process. So every night is like so stressful when I start the kiln, and I don't know how I will find my work the day after. So it's very funny because it's very relaxing medium, and at the same time it's the most stressful medium I ever worked with. Whereas drawing is much more calm, even if once a mark is done on a paper, most of the time it's impossible to get the complete white lines that I use in the paper itself. So both of them are not really like good at going back on your mistake. And in terms of building the narratives, so I think it's all started with my charcoal drawing and creating different windows, as I was saying, of what this world, like this suspended world in time, could look like. And I really felt the need to translate them into sculptural pieces in order to fully immerse the viewer into the work. And I also make the comparison saying like, I feel a bit like a kind of an art historian or archaeologist, and like just bringing back these artifacts from like this old forgotten civilization. So in my imaginary, it's kind of making it more real to bring back us 3D totemic sculptures. And I really enjoy doing this back and forth. And that's why I often also include my sculptures in the drawings themselves. And some of the characters are also becoming sculptures. So it's all a conversation which feeds the whole narratives and the story.
Oh, I love that. That's, again, that was really helpful to hear, because I just, as you were talking, I'm like, oh, that's amazing. So you're basically almost creating evidence of the reality of this world through the physicality of these sculptures. And I love that you said that you're now including the sculptures in the drawings and vice versa. It's like they're basically reaffirming the I guess, again, a kind of reality of this fictional narrative. And I mean, in a lot of ways, that's what all of your work is doing. It's essentially confronting the viewer with evidence of a way of seeing that is a reality that's either pushing against perceived norms or like kind of hegemonic norms in a lot of ways, and trying to evidence new ways of thinking about those norms through these physical objects. I guess the process-based aspect too really does make me think about physicality. And as we had briefly talked about, I'm interested in how each of you are again, working conceptually, but also working figuratively. So similar to how these, like Emma, as you described, these more traditional materials suddenly being kind of reclaimed as conceptual, having conceptual potential, where for a period in the time, maybe from like even the 50s to the 90s, quite honestly, there was this idea that if you're making conceptual art, it's either dematerialized or it's a photo or it's a video. It's not printmaking, it's not painting, it's not ceramics, it's this other type of materiality. But again, this idea is too about the figure somehow being almost entirely bound to narrative, as opposed to it having, or to the self, so it's a narrative of the self. I think that's sort of similar, but I'd just be interested in how you guys, and I'm going to go through the same sequence. We'll start with you, Julia. Like, how are you thinking about then resituating the body, like playing with this idea of like the body both being bound to all this history and then thinking of it now as maybe a apparatus for working through concepts?
Sure. So it's funny what you were just saying about how like between the 50s and the 90s, if you were making conceptual work, it couldn't be like a physical material. Like that's an art world myth, right? That we're all kind of deconstructing in this show and in our world, in our work. And thank God my background's in printmaking, and I didn't digest too much of that in my early years of making work. But I'm sorry, I totally lost the question. We're talking about how the figure is the narrative.
Yeah, it's important. I think it both is this idea of also the physicality of all of this work that the three of you make, but also, and having it also rooted somehow visibly in figuration.
Okay. I mean, I've always been interested in the figure. And again, maybe that's from just my background in printmaking, you know, in a lot of, like, the figures present in a lot of prints and narratives present in a lot of prints. And also the, like, this body of work is about being in your body. So the way that I'm approaching this, it feels necessary to me to include the figure and to include bodies, because it's about, you know, it's about inner worlds. And also, so I've been reading this book lately. I haven't finished it, but it's by a neuroscientist named Bessel. Hold on, let me make sure I'm saying his name right. I have my notes pulled up. Bessel A. van der Kolk, and it's all about how trauma lodges in the body. And he talks about, there's this really great phrase in the book about how we live in this incredibly disembodied culture, where we're not in touch even just with our basic needs. We were briefly talking about this before the panel started, like what felt good to those of us who were lucky enough to be in safe, you know, quarantine situations, you know, during these past couple of months, was kind of slowing down and having some space to get back in touch with ourselves, and not kind of living this capitalist grind culture which doesn't serve anybody except for the Jeff Bezos of the world, you know. So anyway, getting back to the figure, I'm really interested in how do we, like, put our heads, how do we get back in our own bodies and reposition, you know, on our heads onto our bodies in a culture that has separated, like, the mind from the body. So yeah, so it felt really important to me. And also, my work has always been, just speaking of process as well, a way to process things, you know, not only just like processing my emotional and mental and physical experience of the world. So that's really, this body of work was kind of born out of a couple of years of exploring that in my studio. And I feel like during this time of being quarantined and being really lucky to be in a situation where I was still able to work, you know, remotely. I'm also an educator. And, you know, just kind of hide away in my studio, I feel like I turned a corner because I had some space to get back in touch with my body.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I guess it does loop back to why these pieces are also material based. Like you said, that the process actually resituates oneself in a physical experience. And that's a really interesting way of both showing the figure, but literally embodying it in its artifact. But Lola, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, about, again, thinking about the figure, because your work is obviously also dismantling so many ways that we're conditioned to view the figure and fetishize the Black body or problematize it. And it's a, you know, actually then re-engaging it, what does it mean then to represent a body?
Yes, of course. I'm often using history as a tool to reconstruct the present. And so clay, rope, photo, all of these mediums have histories in which exploited, othered, or completely disregarded Black femininity. So as an artist, I'm using these histories to kind of cultivate a narrative that combines this racial otherness and my interest in Black femininity, pleasure, beauty, desire, and sexuality, in order to reconstruct a present that fails, you know, that kind of redoes the work of what history does. So kind of representing complexities and identities and centering Blackness. I'm often using the term femhood or model to reference my sculptures. I'm also using the term jouissance as a term of physical and intellectual form of pleasure. And so all of these terms become a beacon for which, you know, these new narratives are to be understood.
Can you actually talk about the video that is of course static? I'm thinking about, maybe you can describe what the image is, and I feel like it's really
Yes.
related to this whole dynamic between the physical and the making. And
yeah, I'm interested in teetering on the lines between the mundane and the sensual, to suggest or implicate a sense of desire or pleasure. And so the video is titled I Am a Clay Artist. And it's a video of me just rubbing my hands together. I have really long red nails in the video, and I'm rubbing my hands together with slip, clay slip. And so it's kind of entering this discourse of, you know, being a ceramicist and having the history of ceramic or clay arts be confined to the white European or the white male artists. And so I'm very boldly exclaiming that I am too a clay artist, even if this is my means of using the clay. Very mundane way of, you know, it's kind of what we've been doing lately, right? Just washing your hands a lot, you know, or just applying moisturizer because they're so dry, but also there's these gestures that are very sensual. I use a reference video of, it's a very pornographic video, but it was a woman who was kind of, what was she doing? Just, how do I say this without being vulgar?
Just be vulgar, Lola, just be vulgar.
How do I say this in an art context? She was pretty much like, you know, like doing these gestures and kind of, you know, this is what people pay to see. But she was using lotion, and I thought that was just so compelling. You know, I wasn't there for the same reasons everyone else was, but you know, it was, I still found it very interesting. The gesture alone, something very mundane, but also very sensual at the same time.
yeah. Oh no, that's brilliant. I hadn't, that is really funny to think about it in the context of all of our hand washing right now. I also think I love the self-awareness though about like the mythos of the ceramicist too. It's sort of really taking it down several notches. I love that. That's great. I appreciate it. So we're going to then move to you, Emma. I'm thinking about how with your bodies though, how are they related to gender? I know that they're the lost boys, but they look kind of, to me, between genders, or what does a figure mean to you in this narrative?
You're very right. I don't give a lot of importance to their gender at all, even to their identity. It's something I more like hiding it through, like often I will do like elaborate tattoo on them with like baroque patterns or graffiti, and it's not, I don't really insist on their identity as well or their gender. It's always children, so this is something that has been recurrent in my work, and I really love how children are really like tiny human beings, and they have this very innocent like aura around them, let's say, but obviously they have this super dark and savage side, and I love this kind of weirdness about children, that they are so nice and so calm, and then they're like completely feral and out of their mind. So
Yeah.
And there's this book, Lords of the Fly, that I've been pretty recurrent in my work, that I just love and I read regularly, and it's really like work on these boundaries about how it's innate to human beings, this kind of very savage and wild side, and how children are, yeah, very ambiguous creatures. I would say.
Yeah, they are. Well, that is, it's before too, like in terms of at least certain biological genders before they're, I guess, fully matured into those identities. And so there is this weird way in which they're in an indeterminate space, both in terms of also what society is expecting of them, in terms of how they are even going to claim or assign their own genders or their own identities, and yet, and that maybe frees them also from traditional moral behavior as well. You know, like you said, maybe being savage, but that might be somehow permissive because we don't necessarily always restrict the behaviors in the same ways. But yeah, there's something really creepy about that. And yet maybe the Lost Boys are also from Peter Pan too, isn't it? This idea of never growing up. And again, this idea of what does it mean to never necessarily mature, and what is, I don't know what maturity is. What does that mean? You know, who's defining that? And I'm thinking now too about the fragility, like you've mentioned, both you and Lola have mentioned, of the ceramics. It's like they have this capacity to be both very resilient, but also obviously very fragile. We want to tend to them. It's something that it's not necessarily, wasn't on my, it was on my mind, but now is more on my mind, wasn't part of my formal set of questions, but I see it more in thinking through all of your work is this notion of adornment. I feel like each of you have created objects that, sure, you know, you've printed or drawn or sculpted, but then you, even Emma, you describing the predecessors to your ceramic work that were assemblages that where you added all of these pieces. And even with this piece that we see so distantly in the background, it's embellished with all of these, the luster, I guess that's what it's actually called. Is that correct? The gold luster, that that there's this desire to adorn all of this work that I think is really interesting in each of you. And maybe since we're on your work, you can talk about that a little. And because it made me think about it too, with you mentioning the tattoos and how it seems like you're adding to these things, you know, meanings and symbols.
Yeah, definitely. I'm very interested in symbols, and it's something that are present in all of my work. I always love to include little details that no one can see, or like that you really have to read inside the drawing to see it, or the sculptures. So I enjoy hiding little details, accumulation. It's same as my sculpture and my drawing. I often start with like a very small part without a very precise idea of where I want to go. And then it's by accumulating a lot of, for example, for this piece, it's like a lot of petal
Yes.
that after it's taking shape and it creates this vague form of a bust of a person, or the same in the drawings. It's like an accumulation of thousands and thousands of little objects, and I'm looking a lot at how do you call it in English? Julia, Naturmort. Sorry.
It's just the same thing in like a nature mort paintings, like a still life with dead things. Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Because Julia
Right.
It's
Sure. The symbolic of all those objects.
Like the passing of time is very important as well in the symbolic of the subjects, and the accumulation of this like moments like stopped in time. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question fully.
No, that makes sense to me, because I think about, again, even the notion of tattooing or adding the petals, so that these bodies are almost bodies without history. They haven't entered into maturation, but the accumulation of these adornments are telling the story of maybe what they've experienced. So similar to somebody, even as something as simple as like Girl Scouts, you're going to get a little chevron or a patch when you've done something. These are their little sort of symbols of what it is they've either kind of whatever whatever they've either accomplished. I was thinking of even like what they might have killed something. They might have also built something. We don't know. But it's this idea that there may be, we're carrying this in our bodies. It's sort of an interesting way that actually thinking more too, if we now shift to Julia, your work, I see the same thing. Like you're adding these to the shadow boxes, for instance, you're adding all of these pieces that feel like they are these objects, these historic accumulations of what might be what the image is either aspiring to, or what if it is an object of faith, if it were to function as a small kind of wishful object, what it's hoping to be. But I'm interested in it looks like you're adorning the pieces, so I'm interested in that impulse.
Well, I think that we adorn things to celebrate them. Oftentimes, that's one of the first thoughts that came to my mind when you mentioned adornment. I'm also a maximalist myself, and I like to wear a lot of rings and these fabulous earrings my best friend Bessie, who's in this conversation listening, made. So I've always loved to adorn myself, and that probably comes from my wonderful mother who loves clothing and jewelry, and so my whole life has been about adorning, and both my parents have their house is beautiful and has a bunch of art, and my father was a house painter and in construction, and so he was always everything was a work of art. So I think that may just be something that's innate within me. Something that we discussed in our so we had a conversation, everybody. We had a conversation in March, right before lockdown happened, like right as the pandemic was getting serious in the United States. And we had this really lovely conversation between, all the artists and Terry. And it's going to be published in the catalog, which will be out soon. And all three of us have this notion of the grotesque in our work, which is like this really huge notion, which I'm going to probably need a little help unpacking. But part of that is this tradition of adornment, and how throughout time that's sort of run counter to these very like Eurocentric Renaissance sensibilities of what's beautiful, and also, I mean, even if you're thinking of like abstract painting, can kind of be austere, and adornment's kind of the opposite of that. And that can be a way to, this is a conversation I've had with another good friend of mine who's on this meeting as well, Marissa, about how it can be a way to break down hierarchies, through adornment and using the grotesque in different ways. So I think all of that is really playing a part in my work.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's a really good connection I hadn't thought about. So you're right, this idea of both the abstract sublime that is held in, the kind of minimalist austerity, or even in classical sculpture, this idea of the pristine nude, unadorned again.
Right.
And again, who was authoring that aesthetic? Obviously. Lola, I like your face. Yes. So it's a really, and I think that's a good bridge to your work, though, too. I remember when I first saw your work in the first year crit, and again, you had when you were in grad school, and again, piercing nipples that were emerging from these amorphous sculpted surfaces, and a desire to add like the chains. And I just loved that. Like, it's such an interesting way of thinking about form. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on even the way this sculpture, I'd say, is adorned with rope and has lipstick on it, I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Much like Julia, I'm interested in the celebration of self, whether it is to assert my presence or to be used as a tool for a desire or an attraction. So a lot of my use of adornment comes from two different discourses, and one being Black female rap discourse, and the other one being pornographic, Black feminine pornographic discourse. And so within these two worlds, the subjects they both use, bling bling or crystals or studded rhinestones or flashy jewelry to kind of adorn themselves as this indication of wealth or status. And so I engage in both of these contexts and both principles, as I am interested in, how desire itself can implicate viewership, how one comes to know and exercise their own desires. And so that also leads to, how one internalizes their own desirability or possible lack thereof, and the implications that derive from the racial, gender, and sexual expression of desire. And so with the work that is at Gallery 210, I am using rope as an adornment for one of the models, one of the sculptures, as well as, these openings that look like, a reminiscent of the human mouth with lipstick. So the rope can be tied to the past and the present in terms of, Black identity or the Black body. And so using this very loaded kind of material in this way that devours these myths or this discourse surrounding, or this mythical discourse surrounding Black femininity. The piece itself is entitled Devouring Vines. And so devour is to swallow or eat up hungrily, or, and things of that nature. But I'm using the rope to kind of symbolize this kind of othered or objectified objectivity or over-sexualized kind of symbolization, and using that to kind of overtake or to devour, which is to dispel or to overpower. And so kind of reclaiming the rope for myself. Rope is also tied to BDSM bondage, and sexual acts. And so kind of opening up this way of seeing the rope outside of, a harmful indigenous act, and opening it up to a possible tool that can be used for pleasure. And so with that, the use of the jute rope exposes, a provocative tension between domination and ownership of the Black body.
Well, thank you. I think that I realize that we've actually been talking now for almost an hour. And so I want to now shift to maybe, we have one question, but I'd invite anyone who has questions right now to add any. But I'll start with from Megan Cass. We have two quick questions for Julia. Can you talk about utilizing the triptych format for your work and what artist most influenced your work? Judith Bernstein comes to mind when I see your work.
Good question. I actually am not familiar with Judith Bernstein, so I am going to promptly look her up when this ends. Thank you for that recommendation. So the triptychs are really influenced by Hieronymus Bosch. I love Bosch paintings. They're so wild. And I just love the triptych format. I love how you could have like a central panel with, maybe the central piece of the story, and then the side panels could be maybe like different narrative scenes, or perhaps like close-ups on different details. I'm also really inspired by Frida Kahlo. She's hands down my favorite artist. Also for this body of work in particular, Betty Saar, and the shadow boxes and the assemblages that she makes. And she's a printmaker. Yeah, very inspired by her work as well. And like I mentioned in the beginning, my favorite art and best art in the world is from Mexico, in my opinion. And so I'm very lucky to have a very dear friend who lives there, and I get to go visit her. And I always come back with different art pieces from different artists. So those are some of the artists that really influence my work.
Thank you. And thanks for your question, Megan. Anyone else have a question they'd like to ask? Have it open for a few more minutes. Meanwhile, while you're thinking about that, anything, Emma, Julia, Lola, that you feel like you'd really like to, I mean, I would have loved to touch on how these past 3 months have been affecting your practice, but that's either something you've had to answer a lot and don't want to talk about, or something that I'd like to hear, but it's so I'll leave that up to you if you feel comfortable answering.
Well, for me in particular, I've been forced to think more about accessibility or lack thereof, and kind of using that as well as, as a way to enter or talk about Black femmehood. And so it's presented an interesting challenge in kind of how I create work, especially in terms of sculpture. And so a lot of the photos you see, maybe 2 out of 3 that are shown in this show, are Polaroids, or they're made of Polaroid images or used Polaroid images. And so because it's very accessible, it's something that is printable at home. You don't have to take it anywhere or to get it processed or to get, or prints ordered. And so kind of using the Polaroid, referencing the history of the Polaroid, but also using it as a way to create work, is very intimate because they're so small. It's a Polaroid mini. So it creates this very intimate moment.
Tiny ones, right? Okay. Because and I think that are any of those visible in this install image? Let me just, I see, yes, because they're hard probably from this perspective to read, but those are with the red frames and the wide matting.
The very wide matting presents this kind of voyeuristic moment that you see a peep of something or a peep of flesh. And so it speaks to how we've been kind of locked away and had to have so much time with ourselves and being confronted with ourselves. And so I think that the correlation between quarantine and using Polaroid images to record the body is very interesting in terms of accessibility.
Yeah. We do have a question that Mike Bailey is, I am thinking about the body as vessel and the clay forms of Lola's relating to that. We talk about the clay body and how clay carries memory. I like to think of that in relation to the figurative clay pieces in the show. I'm also thinking about the vessel in Julia's boxes as a holder. Thank you all, great work, great talk. I think it's almost a comment.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Mike. Clay is very visceral and very bodily, so it definitely makes sense.
That's right, the notion of the vessel too, absolutely. And Julia and Emma, do you have any thoughts about these last few months and how it might have impacted your practice?
Emma, go ahead if you're ready.
Yeah, I on my hand, it's been forcing me to work from home instead of my very nice studio with kiln and everything. So it's been a bit more challenging, like in terms of even just finding the space to do it. And this is actually was really interesting because I worked on much smaller scale. So on this picture on the far left, there is the first sculpture I did in quarantine, which is this little feral lost boy on top of this little tower. And it's really like I feel like open a new little direction in my work, like trying to, instead of creating these giant pieces, which were pretty big in terms of sculptures and drawings in the past, it forced me to work more like in smaller scales, paying much more attention to the tiniest little detail. So this has been pretty good surprise, I would say, that I would have ventured if this one didn't happen. And yeah, it was a very happy surprise.
Yeah, same here. Again, my husband and I have been very, my whole family, we've been very lucky to, to have been okay, and for the most part, healthy and okay. And so, and I was still able to work, and still able to teach from home. And so the quarantine felt like space, in some regards. And I really just gave myself time. The first month of quarantine, it was like a big adjustment. And I felt, I just gave myself time to grieve, basically, and feel really sad about everything that's happening in the world. And I decided to start gardening for the first time, and just doing something else and being like, okay, I was trying to, pump some artwork out, and it wasn't really happening at first. And so instead of, having this, again, like this grind culture mindset of like, I have to be productive and my self-worth is linked to my productivity, I decided to just like give myself a break and relax and plant a vegetable garden. And that really gave me some space to think, and also to I don't know, it just gave me some space. And I feel really grateful for that aspect of it. And working from home, has worked out fine too. But that's also because I did most of my printing before. I have a nice little lovely printing etching press behind me. Hi, little etching press. But it's pretty small compared to the work I normally make. So so all of the painting worked out just fine at home.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree more about this idea of space and not participating in this capitalist grind culture, as you call it. I really like that.
It's a lie. Don't listen to it.
Yeah, I don't like capitalist grind. I like the term. I do hope that, I just hope we can take this as a cue, as I mentioned, and just before the talk, I feel like, even with the fall approaching, there is some desire on even the part of the art world to sort of return to its return to normal, whatever that is. And I as though there was nothing to learn from these past few months, and I find that really troubling and sad, because I do think creativity actually comes from allowing oneself not to know what to do, to have the space to actually be a little lost, frankly. Mm-hmm. And to allow thoughts to generate on their own time. I know, especially Lola, you've also just emerged from grad school, and like the pressure that we put on ourselves to produce something and have a mission behind it isn't necessarily always what produces the best work. But anyway, I'm not here to talk, but I appreciate what all of you guys have done. And I think that this is probably a good time to wrap up. So any other final thoughts that you'd like to add before we close up?
Oh, good.
For me.
So much.
Thank you, everyone. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank each other right now. It's always odd with these Zoom talks. It's both a dream and a nightmare of social events, because it's like I can just vanish. It's also kind of sad because it's like I just vanished. Anyway, Terry, any final thoughts?
I want to thank everyone for participating tonight, and especially all the folks who logged on to catch this wonderful conversation. The gallery is available by visitation only, so call the gallery at 314-255-7451 or send me an email at suhret@elmsville.edu, and I'll be happy to schedule a visit for y'all in. Masks are required and numbers less than 10. But it's a gorgeous show. I want to share it with everyone.
Terry, could you put your email address in the chat just in case people didn't hear it, if you don't mind?
Not at all. Here's the phone.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
If you don't have questions, we'll take more flattering comments too. Keep them coming.
Yeah, I like those.
And please, if you feel safe and comfortable coming to the gallery and wearing a mask by yourself or in a small group, we worked really hard on this show, and all of our work is super complex. And even though we will have a really wonderful virtual exhibition for you on the website, it's a totally different experience to see it in person. So if you are able and comfortable
Absolutely.
and healthy enough to come and see it in person, please do make an appointment. The show will be up until December 5th, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. And to those of you who cannot make it, please stay tuned for the link to the virtual show, which will also be fabulous.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.